talk. The next is a diminishing number of Holocaust survivors that have firsthand knowledge of what occurred during the Holocaust. And then the third is a simple breakdown of confidence in our and belief in our institutions of civic engagement, things like the Supreme Court, the Congress, those sorts of things. So these are all some trends that are going on right now in the country and in the world, and that's really the crossroads where our curriculum for the Holocaust comes into play. Now, individually, each of these would be a cause for alarm, but collectively, I think they are a call for action and action now, to borrow a phrase from President Roosevelt. And so what the Roosevelt Presidential Library Education Department has done to take this action, it can be seen in a couple of things. About 4 years ago, we started a civics initiative called the Goodman Initiative for American Youth. It's a civics program, and we started that with some great support and encouragement from Jack and Fritzie Goodman. And we created a series of civic programs that have been used by over 24 teachers, 600 students a year in 5 of the school districts here in the Hudson Valley. And the Goodman Initiative was an opportunity for us to learn a lot about how students understand their role in society. And we believe this is very important to what took place during the Holocaust. The work that we did with the Goodman Initiative became sort of the foundation for a National Archives initiative on civics as well. And I had the honor of serving on a small committee to help develop a curriculum for K through 2nd grade and 3 through 5th. And there'll be also programs developed for middle school and high school kids as well, based upon civic engagement and understanding civic responsibility. And in the first 2 weeks of our soft launch back in September, we had over 4,000 students from 28 states participate in that program. And so from that, developed this idea for the curriculum guide that we have for the Holocaust to be based upon civic understanding and civic value. And what the curriculum guide that we have to offer does, and I've got a hard copy of it right here, so if you print it out and put it in a notebook, it looks like this. What this does is it combines several key factors. It combines footage from the 1946 film Nuremberg. It combines documents from our collection, and it applies civic concepts to examine and explain how and why the Holocaust occurred. Now, Per Lorenz was FDR's filmmaker, and the curriculum is based upon the film Nuremberg, which was actually a film with over 150 hours of film footage of the Nuremberg trials of some of the key Nazis after the end of the Second World War. And then about 50 hours of that was pared down, and then from there it was pared down again to a film a little over an hour. And our friends over at Drake Creative were working with us through a grant through the New York Community Trust to break this film down into 8 separate sections so that we can examine the step-by-step progression of how Hitler and the Nazis brought about the Holocaust. And what we did was we created, along with that, each of these sections a piece of curriculum, a set of curriculum that goes along with that. So basically the idea of this is, you probably can't show the Nuremberg trial in a classroom, 45 minutes in an average high school or junior high school classroom. However, what you can do is break the film down into sections, and that's exactly what we've done. So the first section talks about the Nuremberg trial, why this was important. And it was important because it was really one of the first times that film was used as evidence in a court case. And this wasn't just any film. This was film of some of the most horrific events in world history. And the shocking, as if the images and the concept is not shocking enough, what's additionally shocking is that the film that was used as evidence in this trial was actually film that the Nazis shot themselves. So what the Nuremberg trial did was it put the Nazis on trial with their own films, their own documents, their own primary source materials that made the case against them. And that was very, very important. It also was made to explain to European audiences what happened. How did this occur? How did this happen in a country in the middle of Europe, in the middle of the 20th century, that such a horrific thing could take place? And the film was also important because it established certain criteria that really needed to be established. One of those was this concept of crimes against humanity, crimes against the peace, the idea of what a war crime is, and this idea of conspiracy. So this is what the basis of the film is all about. And then it's got the 6 or 8 sections, and you can watch these. They're all about no more than 8 minutes long, so you can watch them in a standard high school social studies class if you'd like, or you can assign it to the students to watch it on YouTube. And there's a section on the lead up to how the Nazis came to power. There's a section on the blueprint for world domination. There's a section on the crimes against humanity. There's a section on the Roosevelt administration and the actions and inactions that the Roosevelts took during his time in office. And then there are some essential questions and themes and concepts that surround the Holocaust, which are really, we believe, civic-based. So we've created this curriculum, and each section has an overview of what was going on and a description of what happened in that particular section. Then there is critical vocabulary, because so many of the students don't understand what some of these concepts mean. So it lays out these concepts straight up. Each of the sections has this. There are some short answer questions that the students can answer about the film that they saw, just to make sure they're processing and paying attention. And then there are primary source documents for each section. And the primary source documents are documents that come from our collection. And we believe these are very important because it puts right in the hands of the students, copies of some of the documents. I'm going to hold this one up to the screen. Here is the flyleaf from President Roosevelt's copy of Mein Kampf. And you'll note it's dated 1933. And what President Roosevelt's saying here is that, he had read the German version, he had read the American version, and they were 2 separate versions. The version that was being sold to the United States was entirely different and had eliminated much of the anti-Semitism. So Roosevelt was able to see Hitler's number kind of early on. Then we have for each of those some document-based questions. So students can look at these primary sources and begin to glean information about first primary source documents, which is really what the National Archives is all about. And then also the idea of taking a look at these documents to get a sense of what people knew, when they knew it, how they were responding, and what was happening at those particular times. Then we have some essential questions and extension activities so that the teachers can take this to the next level and can bring this into something that's going on, much more, pertinent to today's day and age. Now, what we really like about this curriculum guide is that it's this combination, and it's this this crossroads of what's going on now, and you don't have to go back 80 years to find hate crimes. You don't have to go back 80 years to find anti-Semitism. Sadly, it's all around us. It's happening each and every day. And so what we're trying to do with this curriculum guide is make the current connection to how are these things happening today. How did they happen back then? And what are the themes and threads that ran through those things as well? And so what we try to do is to get the students to work through these things with some very important civic concepts and thoughts as well. So things like hate speech, things like bullying, things like scapegoating, things like divisioning, creating an us and a them. These were all tools that the Nazis used as a drip, drip, drip to come to power and then begin the horrific events that we now know as the Holocaust. And what we're trying to get students to understand is that so much of this material, so much of these activities began as small steps in isolated situations. And when the dots were connected, then you could begin to see how powerful this horror was and how powerful this movement was. And so really what a lot of this was a slippery slope. And I am by no means saying that the people who were victims of the Holocaust, were in any way culpable themselves. The Nazis were very clever about the way they went about crimping and smashing and destroying and taking away civic engagement, civic understanding, and destroying civic institutions. So we've made this curriculum available so the teachers can use it either as bite-sized pieces or they can look at it as a whole. But what we're trying to get them to understand is that the issues that are facing us today are in many ways the same issues that were facing the Roosevelts back in the day. And so we're trying to get them to understand the connection for this and make that connection for students so that the students can understand maybe and put a little bit more concept and context into what the Holocaust is all about. And again, we do that by, including actual, copies of documents, presidential reports. We have charts and graphs, that are nicely able to be understood and depicted through visual representation. And, some of these things are really, incredible to take a look at in the horror. Here is, the blueprint for extermination, and you put this in the hands of a junior high school student or a high school student in the context of the rest of the Holocaust, and it becomes very powerful and very meaningful as well. So what this curriculum guide does is it uses this historic film, which by the way was banned in the United States for almost 65 years. It was unseen in the United States, but we now have access to it. We've broken it up into those bite-sized pieces. You can use it in class. It's on our YouTube page. We've had something like 340,000 views on this curriculum so far. We've had 23,700 downloads of the material from teachers over the past 2 years. And what this curriculum guide does is it provides teachers, it provides students, it provides people interested in the Holocaust, powerful primary sources of film, photographs, and documents. It poses difficult questions for consideration and debate. We can't be afraid to debate these issues, debate these questions. It makes critical current connections of what was going on then to what is going on today. And it encourages students to take action and to build and strengthen their civic understanding and their civic agency in the world today. We cannot let this happen again. And the way we're going to stop this is to, let people know what their civic rights or civic responsibilities are, and to, encourage them to support their civic institutions. Now, on November 2nd, we're having a teacher workshop, a virtual teacher workshop, and we're going to talk more about the curriculum guide. We're going to talk with some folks from the Holocaust Museum, some folks from Echoes and Reflections. And if you're interested in participating in that, please, it's a free virtual conference. Just shoot me an email. I'll register you and we'll make the link available to you. But we believe that having this voice, having this this discussion with young people before it's too late, before they become jaded, before they become set in their ways, and understanding that this stuff doesn't happen overnight, and that the Holocaust was a state-sponsored act, a step-by-step procedure to bring about the destruction of Eastern European Jews. It was not an accident. It did not have to happen. It happened because they made it happen, because the Nazis made it happen. And they made it happen because they destroyed many of those civic institutions. Back to you, Kirsten.
Wow, thank you, Jeff. I'm going to put a link in the chat to the online resources that that Jeff was describing, so everyone can hopefully go and check those out after the session. All right, so next up is Abby Gondek, our Morgenthau Scholar in Residence here at the FDR Library. So Abby, go ahead. Thanks.
So earlier this year, Kirsten interviewed me about my recent digital humanities projects at the FDR Library, including a project where I am doing quantitative analysis of over 3,000 public in support of a refugee camp in the United States in Oswego, New York. And so I wanted to share a little bit of that interview that we did with you. So I thought what I could do first is describe an overall picture of several of the projects that I've been working on. So one of the first projects I started had to do with women's roles in the governmental staff and their impact on the decisions made to try to bring relief and rescue to Jewish refugees in Europe during World War II. So one of my first projects was about the secretary of Henry Morgenthau Jr. And of course, he was the Secretary of the Treasury. So his secretary's name was Henrietta Klotz, and she was very influential on him in pushing him to take a more active role in trying to save Jewish refugees. The second project that I started to work on was about rescuing Jewish children from France and getting them into Spain and Portugal, and the conflicts between state and treasury about that specific issue, and also the conflicts between Jewish organizations about how to rescue the children and where to send the children after they had been rescued. So I've created a series of videos related to those topics that you can watch on our FDR Library YouTube page. And then my most recent project has to do with the emergency refugee shelter, or a refugee camp that was established in the US in 1944. And this project was one of the first major projects that the War Refugee Board worked on. So there are over 3,000 letters from the public in support of the camp that was set up at Fort Ontario in Oswego, New York, and they are available online.
Where can we find those, Abby? They're posted in Franklin, right?
Yes, they are posted in the Franklin search database for the FDR Library under selected digitized documents related to the Holocaust and refugees. And you have to scroll down all the way to the records of the War Refugee Board. And they are listed under admission of refugees into the US, general, and then all alphabetized A through Z. There are also petitions from the Emergency Committee to Save the Jewish People of Europe. And then I wanted to show you what one of the folders looks like. So I have opened the A folder, just as an example. So each of the folders has this is what you would see in the records room. This is the original archival context. So it's made up of usually there is a letter from John Paley, who was the director of the War Refugee Board. That's the kind of first thing that you see. And then the next thing that you would see would be the letter from the public. And sometimes there are multiple letters. Sometimes they address them to the president and also to John Paley. And then this is another letter from John Paley, a cover letter. Mm-hmm. And
this is interesting, right? Because people would write either to the president or directly to the War Refugee Board, and then we have the record of both sides of that correspondence. So if the White House received the letter, they would forward it to the War Refugee Board, and we see not only the original letter here, but also the response from the board.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So, and sometimes the person writing would write to both FDR and John Paley at the War Refugee Board. So you have sometimes multiple letters from the same person.
So tell me what you're exploring with these letters. What research questions and new pathways are you exploring with these?
So one of the goals with the project was to be able to track them in a quantitative way. It's a huge amount of data. So what I've done with the help of interns, John Tappan and Eileen Dennis, is we've created this database of, so far we've gone all the way up through the N folders, A through N. And I wanted to show you just what example of what the database looks like. So basically we're looking for all sorts of different information you can get, including the gender of the sender, including where the letter came from, when the letter arrived, was it handwritten, was it from an organization or an individual, what were the key terms used in the letter? What was the text of the letter? So all these sorts of details. And the reason for this is that though the documents that I was just showing you in PDF form, it is somewhat text searchable, but because of the old-fashioned style of type, you can't find everything that you need. So this is a very comprehensive way of detailing everything that's in the letters. So then future researchers and people in the public can search through all of this data to find things that might be interesting to them. So it's very open-ended for future research on many different topics.
It seems like really, really, really complex data, really great use of information. It seems also that this would be really neat to offer up to the digital humanities community. Can you talk a little bit about how the digital humanities practitioners might be able to leverage some of this information, this data?
Definitely. So one of the ways that I have tried to visually demonstrate that this huge amount of data is to look at the geographic origin of the letters. So from this map, for example, you can see that most of the letters, a huge majority, came from the Northeast. And there are many different hypotheses for why this might be, or ideas about why this might be. It could partially be because of where there were letter writing campaigns, because there's evidence of many different letter writing campaigns within the letters that we've gone through so far. It could also be, these were areas where many Jews lived, and Jews were writing in support of, as part of letter writing campaigns, and also just as individuals in support of the idea of starting a refugee camp in the US. It could also be, there's a huge amount from New York, actually. So it could be that this is a state where FDR had a lot of support. So a really cool feature that I wanted to show you was the ability to click and interact with this map, and then be able to see the original data from the database. I'll just show you that really briefly. Okay, so when you click on a specific city, you can open up the data from the original database. So I'll show you an example of that. Okay, so this is an example of the type of thing that you would see when you open up that specific point on the map, or any of the data that's being visualized. You can open it up to see the original data set, which is, so you can both visualize it in a more interactive and kind of visually interesting way, but you can also go back to the original data as well. So another pattern that I wanted to talk about is something like when the letters arrived. So this is a graph of the trends of when most of the letters came in. So this, I hope you can see at the bottom. This is May, June, July, August. So most of the letters, a lot of letters came in June. And this matches up with the trend of publicity for the idea of setting up a refugee camp in the United States. So there was, in April of 1944, there was an initial article written by Samuel Grafton of the New York Post, and he recommended this idea of free ports. And this was the idea that you could apply the idea of a free port to people. So if you can have goods, come into a port and kind of be in like in between zone, so they wouldn't be charged fees, and they would kind of just be in a holding pattern. So the idea was that you could do the same thing with people, and you could bring refugees to the United States, and they could just stay for a little while on a temporary basis until the war was over, and then they would go back to their homes. So this idea of free ports really took hold. So a lot of the letters from the public talk about the idea of free ports, but FDR didn't like that term, and so they ended up choosing the term emergency refugee shelter because he liked the idea that it was a shelter. He liked the kind of tone of that word, and that it was in the case of an emergency, so that it would be, he wanted to emphasize that it would be temporary and that the refugees wouldn't remain in the United States, even though many of them did eventually end up coming into the United States through regular immigration procedures once the war was over. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to ask, you know, studying the public reaction, you know, what have you learned, and how does this kind of add color to the larger study of this effort?
So something that I'm really interested in that I had mentioned before is the role of women in putting pressure on women within the government, putting pressure on the government to do more to save refugees. But through this project, I've also learned about women's roles as members of the public and members of organizations, including Jewish organizations. So another graph or visual that I wanted to show you was has to do with a type of response where, so types of letters where Jews were explicitly mentioned in the letter. So this is actually, it was not that common for Jews to be mentioned explicitly as part of the group of refugees, but it did happen. And when Jews were mentioned, it was typically from individuals. So you can see, that like the orange is representing the letter does not mention Jews, and the turquoise is saying that yes, the letter does mention Jews. And you can see if the letter mentions Jews, it's more likely that it was an individual. And then this graph down here is showing that it was much more likely for women than for men to mention Jews specifically in their letters. So if I click on this, I can go to the full database again that shows me all the women who mention Jews explicitly. The example that I wanted to show is from a woman named Mrs. W. Gordon, and she's coming from the North Side District Women's Division of the American Jewish Congress. Here she says, we greatly appreciate the splendid work you did in your capacity as the executive director of the War Refugee Board. And we want to assure you that not only the Jewish people in the United States, but every decent American fully supports your humanitarian efforts on behalf of the persecuted Jews of Europe. So here she's actually mentioning Jews 2 times. And so another one of the things that I've done is analyze the types of words that appear many, many times. So the words like humanitarian and persecuted are examples of very commonly occurring words. And then I also, this is a very typical response letter from John Paley. So his response letters were made on templates, basically. And so there was slight changes depending on when he sent the response letters. So as time went on and there was more specific ideas about there was more specific ideas about what exactly the camp would be, where it would be. So here you can see he's saying that they've established this refugee shelter at Fort Ontario, and they've included some additional materials that FDR has written. And then I just wanted to show one more example. And this is what I call a for but response. So there was mostly 4 responses, meaning they were supporting the camp. But there were also a few responses that were in support of the camp, but then, so they were in support of the camp, but they felt like there needed to be more done. So that was about 17% of the sample that I was looking at were these for but type of responses. And I found that individuals were more likely than organizations to express this type of viewpoint. But also going along with my interest in women and gender, women were more likely than men to express a for buts type of response. And then I wanted to show you an example of a Jewish women's organization who sent this type of for buts response. So this is coming from a Miss R.E. Carlin in Jersey City, New Jersey. She was representing the American Jewish Congress, specifically the Business and Professional Women's Chapter of the Jersey City Women's Division of the American Jewish Congress. And it was actually a resolution. So this was also very common when a letter came from an organization, that it would be, they would have a cover letter like this one, and then they would have the actual resolution itself. So I just have focused here on the parts of the letter that emphasize this for buts type of response. So this wording is very common. The failure of the United States of America to take adequate and sufficient measures of rescue would constitute guilt almost equal to that of history's most tyrannic oppressors. And then later she says, or actually it's two women that are writing this, they say that the stand that's been taken by FDR is commendable, but they think that it needs to be expanded and extended to embrace as large a number of refugees as can possibly reach our shores. So this is, the reason it's for but is because it has a bit of critique in it. It's saying we support this idea, but we feel like more needs to be done. And if more is not done, then we're basically being complicit in the murder of all of these people. So that it had a very, these types of letters have a very strong kind of, a stronger sort of sting to them than the just plain for letters. So I found these letters to be like the most interesting, and I also found it interesting that women were more likely than men to express these types of viewpoints. I don't necessarily have a kind of explanation for why, but it's just like an interesting finding to explore more. Thank you, Kirsten.
Okay, thank you, Abby. I love hearing about your digital scholarship for the Morgenthau project. It's just been a really fascinating ride so far, and it's great to revisit that. Thank you so much. All right, so next up we have Nicola Zimring, who's going to tell us about the incredible archival collection donated to the FDR Library by the family of Rudolph Verba, very important character in Holocaust history. So Nicola, please take it away.
In my presentation, I will talk about Rudolph Vrba collection, small but important and fascinating part of FDR's Holocaust collection, together with the War Refugee board papers, to which it is very much connected, and Henry Morgenthau papers, which Abby Gondek just introduced to you. So who was Rudolph Vrba? Why is his collection significant? And why is it part of FDR's Holocaust collection? Rudolph Vrba was a Slovakian Jew who was deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau in 1942, 17-year-old. He spent there almost 2 years. Fortunately, except for a very short period of time, he was able to secure positions within the camp's infrastructure, which provided him with a relative safety. He could avoid the heavy physical labor. He was sheltered from bad weather. He had better access to food. In the camp, Verba met Alfred Wetzler, whom he knew casually from his hometown Trnava. Out of approximately 600 men that were brought to Auschwitz from Trnava, only Verba and Wetzler had survived, and this created a special bond between them, and they trusted each other completely. So here on the left side, you have a photograph of Verba. This picture was taken in 1945. This is Alfred Wetzler. He was 7 years older than Verba, but there are no pictures from his youth. Verba and Wetzler started to plan an escape together. The purpose of the escape was not merely to save themselves. They wanted to tell the world what was really happening in Auschwitz-Birkenau, and thus prevent others from getting on the trains. They wanted to spur the world to take action and liberate the camp. Verba and Wetzel collected all available material, all available data, including verifiable information, in order to make their testimony credible, so their warning would be taken seriously. Verba and Wetzel began their escape on April 7, 1944. Within 2 weeks, they reached their native Slovakia. Almost immediately, they were able to connect with the Jewish clandestine movement, the so-called working group. With their help, they composed a 28 pages long report, which is today known as Vrba Wetzel report, and this report was immediately dispatched to working groups contacts. On May 15th, the mass deportation of Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz started. It was 12,000 Hungarian Jews sent to Auschwitz every day. In the meantime, the report found its way to Switzerland and from there to the rest of unoccupied Europe. By the end of June, excerpts from the report were reprinted hundreds of times in newspapers and even broadcast by BBC, and it caused an international outcry. The American President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, as well as the Pope and the King Gustav of Sweden, were sending strong warnings to Hungarian leader Miklos Horthy to stop the ongoing transports of Hungarian Jewry to Auschwitz-Birkenau, to which Horthy submitted on July 7, 1944, saving approximately 200,000 Jews in central Hungary from the deaths in the Auschwitz gas chambers. The impact of Verba and Wetzler's efforts led to what was described by Martin Gilbert as the largest single rescue of Jews in World War II. After the war, Verba moved to Prague, where he earned a doctorate in biochemistry from Prague Technical University, and he began his scientific career. In 1958, he immigrated from Czechoslovakia, lived shortly in Israel, England, United States, and eventually settled in Canada, where he became a professor of pharmacology at the University of British Columbia. After his death in 2006, Verba's widow Robin donated his entire personal archive to the FDR Library, because Verba always appreciated Roosevelt's role in the defeat of Nazism. So what can we learn from the collection? When we pair Rudolph Vrba Papers with the Refugee War Papers, we can put together an interesting timeline of how the information from the Vrba Wetzel report traveled to the USA, and what was Roosevelt's reaction to it. It provides us with yet another context to the decades-long debate that polarized historians as well as public on whether the Allies, or in our case, America and Roosevelt, could do more to save Jews, whether he was indifferent to the Jewish tragedy. So if we look at the timeline, we see that the report was created by late April 44 and it reached free word in mid-May. War Refugee Board representative in Switzerland, Roosevelt McClelland, received the report on June 15th, and he sent a summary of the report, along with some additional information that detailed the deportation of Hungarian Jews to Washington on June 26th. And this is the document I talk about, June 26th. The same day the document arrived to Washington, Roosevelt sent a sharp message to Horthy and demanded immediate cessation of the deportation. Roosevelt even included a threat of force, a threat on which he delivered, and Budapest was bombed on July 2nd. 5 days later, Horthy stopped the deportations. Although there were multiple reasons for Horthy to make such a decision, there is a consensus among historians that it was the international pressure, but especially the interventions from USA and Great Britain, that had the decisive impact on Horthy's decision. The report in its entirety arrived in Washington on October 12, 1944, and it's also stored in our archive. This is the report. And we can only speculate why it took so long. But at the time it arrived, it was too late to organize any military action. For the last selection and mass murder in Auschwitz took place on October 30th. On November 26th, War Refugee Board provided the entire report to American press, and excerpts were published on the same day and day after by all prominent newspapers in Washington. But over the day before, Germans started to demolish the crematoria as well as the gas chambers. And then on January 27th, Auschwitz was liberated by the Red Army. What else can we find in Vrba's collection? The collection contains a few primary documents that add details to Vrba's extraordinary story. My favorite one is Vrba's identity document, unfortunately without its photo. So after his escape, Vrba had to assume a false identity to protect himself, since there was an active warrant for his arrest. And Vrba, who was born in Rosenberg, spontaneously chose the Czech-sounding name Rudolph Verba. The working group then arranged the ID for him, and it was not a forged ID. It was a valid document issued by a competent state authority, the notary office in Trent. Name and the date of birth and place of birth are also false. You can see the document was issued in May 23rd, 1944. I can also tell you that Vrba's signature remained the same. And as to why the notary issued the document, we can only speculate. My educated guess would be that he was bribed. Vrba identified with this new name so much that he legalized it after the war. And we have a document of this here as well. So you can see in October 15th, 1945, he changed his name from surname from Rosenberg to Vrba and the first name from Volcher to Rudolph. This is also an interesting document. It's a copy obtained from Slovak National Archive in Bratislava. It's actually a record of Vrba's deportation to the east. The Slovakian Jewish Council, the Judenrat, records of all the deportees. They didn't know, even though the destination was unknown. The council hoped that this information would help to bring the deportees back after the war. So you can see Walter Rosenberg, born in 1924 in Topolčany, lives in Trnava, was deported on June 14, 1942. I'd like to draw your attention to this unusual number of 1,001 deportees. The +1 is actually Vrba. He evaded his deportation in transit camp Novaki and managed to escape from there. He was captured 3 days later and added to the next outgoing transport. And for the personnel of the camp, probably wanting to get rid of a troublemaker who would most probably try to escape again, maybe inspire others to escape, and maybe even he would cause an uprising. A large part of the collection consists of letters. Vrba's memoir of a wide range of people who received letters from descendants of Nazi criminals, as well as family members who recognized their loved ones in a book. Category of its own are letters to and from historians. Vrba was always very accommodating when historians approached him. He answered their questions in great detail, swiftly and patiently. Vrba was a perfect historical witness. He was passionate about historical truth, and he was meticulous. Here I listed probably the most prominent historians that corresponded with Vrba, and I think the most thrilling and most worth exploring is the correspondence between Vrba and Martin Gilbert that took place over many years. And it's safe to say these two men became friends. Gilbert asked smart and erudite questions, and Verba provided intelligent, insightful answers. These letters contain many details that were never published. I want to also show you how one person's memory turns into documented history. Look at these images. So the first one is Verba's recollection of his escape, and the second map, the second image is a map that it's a recreation of the escape done by Gilbert, and this image was then published in Gilbert's book Auschwitz and the Allies. There is also extensive correspondence between Miroslav Karny, Czech historian, and Rudolph Verba that deserves closer attention. Karny was Auschwitz survival himself, was very critical, and he constantly questioned and downplayed his achievements. He was very confrontational in his letters. And Verba, even though noticeably frustrated, always answered Karny's questions. And Karny asked very different sets of questions, which require different set of answers, and it's worth reading this correspondence. Verba's collection also chronicles his legal fights against Nazi criminals and Holocaust deniers. Vrba vessel report was used already at Nuremberg trials, even though at that time the real identity of the authors of the report was not known. Verba submitted an affidavit for Eichmann trial, which was not used but is in the collection, and he served frequently and willingly as witness for prosecution against Nazi criminals. Verba's testimony, statements, correspondence with the investigators and prosecutors' offices, these are all part of the collection, and it's captivating reading. And since this conference focuses on the American response to the Holocaust, I want to draw your attention, or I want to specifically mention Verba's cooperation with the Office of Special Investigation, the U.S. Justice Department that was created to identify Nazi criminals living on the U.S. soil with the purpose to expel them. So with Verba's help, Hans Lipschitz, former guard at Auschwitz, was deported from the USA in 1982, and it was the first criminal deported through the efforts of the agency. On the left side, you can see a thank you letter written by Neil Scher, the deputy director of the Office of Special Investigation, in which he thanks Verba for his invaluable assistance in Lipschitz's case. And on the right side, you can see the order of deportation. I hope I was able to sketch the essence of Verba's collection and to pique your interest to explore it even further. However, a piece of Verba's story is missing in the collection. A piece I discovered by a chance in Prague's archive of Czechoslovak secret services, where I was searching for materials unrelated to my presentation. On a hunch, I asked whether they have a file on Rudolph Verba, and they had, and they bought one. And I learned that Verba was a target of serious attempt by the Czechoslovak secret services to recruit him as an agent between the years 1958 and 1967. And I think it just demonstrates how crucial it is to have archival materials available online, how important it is for archives to cooperate, share databases, and utilize digital humanities tools, so complete information would be available to the public as well as to the researchers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicola. That was a wonderful presentation. The next to follow up is Sylvia Naylor from the National Archives and Records Administration. Sylvia, could you tell us about the various records at NARA that might be of interest to this audience?
Thank you, Kirsten. Good morning. My name is Sylvia Naylor, and I'm an archivist and subject matter expert for Holocaust-related records at the National Archives at College Park, Maryland. The National Archives at College Park is a major repository of records relating to the Holocaust, including records on concentration camps, Holocaust-era assets, refugees, and war crimes. During today's presentation, I will be providing an overview of World War II war crimes records and resources relating to war crimes trials in Europe. The United States conducted war crimes trials in Europe under 3 jurisdictions: the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, U.S. Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, and U.S. Army courts. General authority for the proceedings of all 3 jurisdictions was derived from the Declaration of German Atrocities, the so-called Moscow Declaration, released November 1, 1943, which expressed Allied determination to arrest and bring to justice Axis war criminals. This declaration of intent served as one of the bases for all war crimes trials, whether undertaken by military commissions, U.S. military tribunals, or international military tribunals. Records in the National Archives custody document American participation on international bodies and the activities of American organizations in the investigation and prosecution of German war criminals. Next slide, please. The records I will be discussing today are located in the following record groups at the National Archives at College Park, Maryland. Record Group 238, which is National Archives collection of World War II war crimes records. Record Group 153, Office of the Judge Advocate General Army records. And Record Group 549, Records of U.S. Army Europe. Next slide, please. Among the holdings of Record Group 238, there are records of the International Military Tribunal, or IMT, which was the international trial against 24 major Nazi leaders held in Nuremberg, Germany. In May 1945, President Truman appointed Justice Robert H. Jackson as representative and chief of counsel for the United States in preparing and prosecuting the Allied case against these major Axis war criminals. On August 8, 1945, Justice Jackson signed the London Agreement along with French, British, and Soviet representatives to establish an international military tribunal to fulfill this task. The initial indictments were filed with the IMT against 24 German defendants, including Hermann Göring, Rudolph Hess, Joachim von Ribbentrop, Alfred Rosenberg, Hans Frank, and others. The defendants were tried individually and as members of the Nazi groups and organizations to which they belong, such as the Schutzstaffel, or SS, the Geheime Staatspolizei, Secret State Police, or Gestapo, die Sturmabteilung, SA, and the General Staff and the High Command of the German Armed Forces. The trial began on November 20, 1945, and concluded on October 1, 1946. Individually and collectively, the defendants face criminal accusations on 4 counts: the common plan or conspiracy, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes. Justice Jackson headed the Office of U.S. Chief of Counsel for the prosecution of Axis criminality that led the U.S. efforts at the IMT trial. The IMT records include original and photostatic copies of documents collected for use as evidence, transcripts of the proceedings, background and reference files prepared in connection with the trial, prosecution exhibits and document books, defense document books and closing arguments, interrogation reports, a record copy and working papers produced in connection with the publication titled Nazi Conspiracy and Aggression, as well as sound recordings, motion pictures, and photographs related to the IMT. Next slide, please. The most relevant textual records comprise several series of captured documents collected and evaluated by American and other Allied investigating teams. Together, they comprise the United States Evidence Files, 1945 to 1946, National Archives Identifier 305-264. Under this NIAD, the researchers will be able to find descriptions of those records in our online catalog. These files are arranged in numbered subseries that reflect their subject matter or location of exploitation. Each document in this subseries is usually accompanied by a complete or partial English language translation and a staff evidence analysis form that indicates the significance of the documents. The PS, or Paris Story Document subseries of evidentiary documents, is the earliest and most sustained collection of war crimes documentation prepared in Paris under Robert Story. Records in this series document Adolf Hitler's rise to power, the development of the Nazi plan of aggression, and the commission of acts of aggression. In the PS sub-series, each numbered document may consist of a single page, a complete file, a published pamphlet or book, or a set of albums. Examples of some of the PS documents include 141 PS, which is an order by Hermann Göring concerning the seizure of Jewish art treasures in France by the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, or ERR, from November 1940. 406 PS, which is a memorandum by Julius Streicher, accompanied by several reports by different NSDAP members concerning the Kristallnacht pogrom of 9-10 November 1938 and its aftermath. Or 1417 PS, which is a printed copy of Reichsgesetzblatt, Teil 1, 1935, number 125, publishing a decree that excluded Jews from German citizenship. Next slide, please. On this slide, I included a scan of the first page of the Reichsgesetzblatt, an English translation included in the file, as well as the staff evidence analysis form, which lists the source of the original document, the persons implicated, a summary of relevant content of the document, and cross-references to related records. Next slide, please. Another series of International Military Tribunal evidentiary documents is titled United States Exhibits 4546. It is arranged numerically by a U.S. exhibit number and consists of documents introduced in evidence before the IMT by U.S. representatives. Some of the USA exhibits include USA Exhibits 251, which are Mauthausen dead books. They've been digitized and are available in our online catalog. USA Exhibit 275, a report titled Es gibt keinen jüdischen Wohnbezirk in Warschau mehr, or The Jewish Quarter of Warsaw is no more. Commonly known as the Stroop Report, is the official SS report prepared by Jürgen Stroop, which documents the suppression of the 1943 Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, the destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto, and the deportation of the last surviving Jews of Warsaw, or USA Exhibit 463, which consists of letters of Luftwaffe General Erhard Milch to Karl Wolff and Heinrich Himmler concerning high-altitude medical experiments carried out on inmates in Dachau, May-August 1942. Next slide, please. On this slide, I included the title page of the Stroop report and two photographs, two of the 67 photographs included in the report. And the report has also been digitized and is available in our online catalog. The exhibits introduced by the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union have been microfilmed as National Archives microfilm publication T988 and can be viewed in our microfilm reading room. Next slide, please. Record Group 238 also contains records of the 12 war crimes trials held in Nuremberg subsequent to the IMT trial. These trials, which took place between October 1946 and April 1949, are collectively known as United States Military Tribunals Nuremberg, or the subsequent proceedings. U.S. Military Tribunal at Nuremberg tried over 180 individuals in 12 separate proceedings, grouped according to type of crime or organization. Since the IMT had already established the criminality of war crimes, aggressive war, and crimes against humanity, these trials were for the purpose of determining the guilt of second-tier Nazis accused of those crimes. The office responsible for these proceedings was the Office of the Chief of Counsel for War Crimes, or OCCWC. Next slide, please. Records for each of these cases typically include transcripts and minutes of the proceedings in English and German, prosecution exhibits and defense exhibits, prosecution document books and defense document books, the official court file, as well as other court papers such as court orders, prosecution closing statements, defense opening and closing statements, defense final pleas, the judgment of the tribunal, and defendants' clemency petitions. Selected documents from each trial were subsequently made available in the publication titled Trials of the Major War Criminals before the Nuremberg Military Tribunals under Control Council Law No. 10, which is available digitally on the Library of Congress website. Next slide, please. I would like to show you one of the prosecution exhibit number 86, used in medical case 1. It is a letter from Russia to Karl Brandt regarding chilling experiments at Dachau. Next slide, please. The National Archives has microfilmed most of the records of these 12 trials and produced descriptive pamphlets to accompany the microfilm publications, which are listed on the War Crimes section of NARA's website. I have also listed here the formal and common names for each case, trial dates, the National Archives microfilm publication number, and the number of rows for all 12 trials. So you can see we have medical case, Milch case, justice case, Einsatzgruppen case, and so forth. Some of the most relevant documents maintained by the OCCWC and its subordinate units are those collected in preparation for and use during the trials. The materials were organized by a general subject into six document series. Each document typically includes the German document, summary of content of the document or English language translation, and the staff evidence analysis form that specifies the evidentiary relevance of the document. This series include Nuremberg government or NG documents, which contain records relating to the activities of various Reich ministries, Nuremberg industrialists or 9 documents, which deal mainly with alleged crimes committed by German industry, finances, economic affairs, particularly those affecting the Krupp, Flick, and IG Farben industrial firms. 5 of those series have been microfilmed, may be viewed in our microfilm reading room, and all of the series are listed on our War Crimes records section on archives.gov. Next slide, please. In addition to the IMT and subsequent proceedings, there were also war crimes cases tried by the U.S. Army. From 1945 to 48, the U.S. Army tried 1,672 individuals in 489 proceedings. All cases were tried at the site of the former concentration camp, Dachau. These records are located in 2 record groups. Record Group 153, records of the Office of the Judge Advocate General, Army, which includes case records and other files pertaining to war crime trials maintained by that office in Washington, D.C., and Record Group 549, records of United States Army Europe, which contains the records generated by Army war crimes agencies subordinate to the Office of Judge Advocate General in Europe. Neither record group by itself provides full documentary evidence of the cases, but they complement one another. We advise researchers to consult both record groups when conducting research on war crimes trials conducted by the U.S. Army. Next slide, please. Next slide, thank you. Case records of the branch headquarters constitute the majority of war crimes. The majority of World War II records within Record Group 153 document the activities of the Army Judge Advocate General's JAG War Crimes Branch, established in October 1944 to centralize the investigation and prosecution of war crimes committed against U.S. personnel. In addition, the War Crimes Branch also investigated and prosecuted general war crimes and atrocities that had occurred in the areas that subsequently came under American military jurisdiction. With its headquarters in Washington, D.C., the branch also maintained numerous field offices in Europe. Case records of the branch headquarters constitute the majority of war crimes documentation in RG 153. The main collection consists of case files 1944 to 49 of specific war crimes or groups of related war crimes. This series is arranged according to a numerical scheme in which the first number designates a geographic location such as country, island group, or body of water in which a war crime was committed, and the second number indicates the incident or case number within the area represented by the first number. Thus, all war crimes cases for Germany are filed sequentially under 12. For example, case 12-226 concerned the operation and administration of Dachau concentration camp. Case files include correspondence, investigative reports, interrogation, trial records, and transcripts for those cases brought to trial, and clemency petitions and reviews. Also included are photographs of atrocities, exhibits introduced in evidence at war crime trials, and newspaper clippings. Next slide, please. So how do researchers use these records? There are several different indexes to these case files that can be used depending on the information a researcher has relating to the war crimes. For example, there is the European Name Index, European Organization Name Index, European Place Name Index, Stalag Name Index, War Crimes Committed Against Prisoners of War Index, or Witness Name Index. Several of those indexes have been fully digitized and are available in our online catalog. The indexes usually provide the case number in the upper right corner, a brief summary of the content of the documents indexed, and often the date the document was filed and the document number. For example, let's look at the European Name Index, which a card from I have on the slide. It is fully digitized and available in our online catalog. Each card in this series contains the name of an individual, a case number, a summary of information from the case relating to the individual, the letter V, which stands for victim, W for witness, or A for accused, and often the date the document being described was filed and the document number. I had a name of Earl Koch and wanted to see if there are any records relating to this individual. I looked him up in this index and learned that he was a victim, which is indicated next to his name by the letter V in the upper right corner and is mentioned in case number 12-666. This document was filed in June 1945 as document number 1. Captain Koch refused to divulge military information during interrogation and was shot in April 1945 by the Bürgermeister of Oberwilzingen in Germany. This is according to the summary on the card. With this information in mind, I can now look at the file in question, which according to the container list for the series in the National Archives online catalog is located in box 314. This would provide me with enough information to request the records in our research room. Another important series of record RG 153 is the Persons and Places dossiers, which this series consists of correspondence, photographs, interrogation reports, memorandum, testimonies, messages, clemency petitions, interviews, diaries, newspaper clippings, and magazine articles containing information relating to person and places and the war crimes associated with those persons and places. These include persons such as Hans Frank, file 100-66, and places such as Stalag 3D, file 100-405. Backward information on war crimes can be found in the series titled Setup Files, arranged in accordance with the two-number filing scheme, in which the first number indicates the category in which the file is located, and the second number is the file within the category. Subjects covered include apprehension of Axis war criminals, category 104, investigation of war crimes and correspondence in connection, 105, forced labor and deportation crimes, 106, lists and directories of war criminals, suspects, enemy officials, enemy military leaders, enemy industrialists, 110, German military government in occupied territories, 113, and others. Next slide, please. Record Group 549 contains the records of the War Crimes Branch, U.S. Army Europe, which includes the war crimes trials records of U.S. Army courts in Germany from 1945 to 48. War Crimes Branch records include documentation of the cases brought to trial, of cases investigated but not tried, and associated records relating to war criminals' imprisonment, parole, and release. The records are very closely related to the case files of the Office of the Judge Advocate General in RG 153 that I just discussed. Researchers should use both collection in any review of pertinent cases. Relevant records of cases brought to trial are located in the series titled War Crimes Trials Case Files 4758, commonly known as Cases Tried. These records constitute the trial records of the 489 cases tried by U.S. Army courts involving nearly 1,700 individuals accused of war crimes. These cases can be roughly divided into 4 categories: main concentration camp cases, cases of concentration camps attached to the main camps, flyer cases, and miscellaneous cases. The first category, main concentration camp cases, comprises 6 cases with about 200 defendants, mainly staff members and guards of Dachau, Buchenwald, Flossenbürg, Mauthausen, Nordhausen, and Mühldorf concentration camps. The second category, cases of concentration camps attached to the main camps, includes about 250 proceedings against approximately 800 guards and staff members of the out camps and branch camps of the major camps. The third category, flyer cases, encompasses more than 200 cases in which about 600 persons, largely German civilians, were prosecuted for the killing of some 1,200 US nationals, mostly airmen. The fourth category, miscellaneous cases, consists of a few cases, including the Malmedy massacre trial, in which more than 70 Waffen-SS men were tried for murdering large groups of surrendered US prisoners of war during the Ardennes offensive, or the Hadamar murder factory case, in which a number of Hadamar asylum staff members stood trial for the killing of nearly 500 Russian and Polish nationals. In some cases, the records are fairly complete within this series. For example, records of the Flossenbürg concentration camp case 000-5-46, include pretrial records such as authorization orders, charge sheets, and several volumes of records of headquarters, U.S. Third Army relating to war crimes committed at Flossenbürg, trial transcripts of proceedings and prosecution and defense exhibits, and post-trial records such as review of sentences, clemency petitions, arrests, prison and execution records, and parole and release records. In other cases, however, these materials are divided between RG 549 and 153. Depending on the subject of the case files, there are records on medical experiments, health condition in concentration camps, death certificates and death registers of concentration camps, inmate, daily lists of inmates of certain concentration camps, transfer lists of inmates, personnel and identification files, reports concerning capture of American flyers and treatment of captured enemy pilots, and others. The National Archives has microfilmed the records of several of these trials, combining pertinent sections from both record groups where appropriate. These cases, along with the dates of trials, RG 153 and 549 case file designation, a popular name of case, and NARA microfilm publication number are listed on our War Crimes Records webpage. So the cases, just to mention a few, is Hadamar case, Nordhausen concentration camp case, Mühldorf concentration camp case, and others. Records of investigation of war crimes that were never brought to trial due, for example, to insufficient evidence or often to the inability to locate the suspected perpetrators are located in the series titled War Crimes Investigations Case Files, commonly known as cases not tried. The extent of information in these files varies considerably from a few pages of correspondence to several volumes of investigative materials. For some war crimes investigations, this series contains the most extensive documentation available. For example, case 11-22, which includes eyewitness affidavits, reports, photographs, and some original SS personnel records in the investigating of the killing of 2 American airmen in France in August 1944. Again, this record should be compared with those located among record group 153. Access to the contents of those 2 series, cases tried and cases not tried, is facilitated by 2 series of card indexes. The first one is titled Index to War Crimes Case Files 4747. It is arranged alphabetically by the last and first names of individuals and contains information relating to these individuals. There are to suspects, witnesses, and victims involved in war crimes trials and investigations. In addition, there is a more specialized name index of the Malmedy case. This index lists the names and units of individuals involved in the massacre of Allied prisoners of war that occurred during the German Ardennes offensive in December and January 1945. Next slide, please. Here I have an example from cases not tried, located in a file 000-12-463. It is the so-called Dameron report. It's a report of investigation of war crimes, Hartheim, signed by Major Charles H. Dameron, investigator examiner, on July 17, 1945. And this report consists of 13 pages and provides a summary of facts, a list of persons implicated in war crimes, names of known employees at Hartheim with position in the castle and last known address, and a list of the 14 closed exhibits. Castle Hartheim in Alkoven near Linz, Austria, was used by the Nazis as an extermination center for mentally handicapped persons and others up to November 1944. Tens of thousands were killed there, either by injection or gas chamber. Next slide, please. Other relevant resources that provide additional information about NARA's holdings relating to World War II war crimes include World War II war crimes records at NARA webpage, Holocaust-era assets webpage, Mauthausen concentration camp complex reference information paper by Amy Schmidt, blog posts posted on text message, unwritten record, as well as History Hub, and IMT publications, Nazi Conspiracy and Aggression, and Trial of the Major War Criminals before the International Military Tribunal. All the two publications have been digitized and are available on the Library of Congress website. Next slide, please. I know that I covered a lot of information today about some of the records at NARA relating to World War II war crimes. I would be very happy to answer any questions you may have about today's presentation. And in addition, please feel free to reach out to me directly by email if you have any questions about the records or specific research topics. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you, Sylvia. That is just an astounding array of resources in the National Archives. Really liked hearing about that. So we have roughly 10 minutes to field some questions from the audience. So we've gotten a few in the Q&A, and audience members, if you'd like to add some more, please feel free to type right into the Q&A tab on the right-hand side. So we'll start off with a couple that came in for Abby specifically regarding the War Refugee Board records that you highlighted in your presentation. First was John Paley, who you mentioned. Was he Jewish? Was one question. And the other was, were there certain organizations more inclined to be in favor of the establishment of that refugee camp in Oswego, New York?
Okay, so in terms of John Paley, he was not Jewish. And actually most of Henry Morgenthau Jr.'s staff wasn't Jewish, except for Henrietta Klotz, who was his secretary, and who I've talked about in some previous presentations this week. And also he had an advisor, Harry White, who was Jewish. But yeah, most of his staff wasn't. So it was pretty incredible that many of his staff members were very forceful in trying to get him to take a more active role in convincing FDR to do more to try to save refugees. And then the other question about organizations that were involved in the letter writing campaigns that I mentioned in my presentation. There were so many organizations, but I went back to my spreadsheet to give you some examples of organizations. So there were synagogues of various different denominations. There was a letter writing campaign from the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, which is now known as the Union for Reform Judaism, which is actually I grew up within that reform movement. So that was super interesting to find. But there were also many other Jewish organizations, including the American Jewish Congress, the American Jewish Committee, Jewish Federations, the Zionist Organization of America. There were also Christian organizations, Christian churches, also the YMCA. Then there was the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. Also workers' unions wrote in, many different kinds of workers' unions. Then there were also companies, government agencies, public schools, the National Refugee Service, all sorts of different organizations. So the plan is to make the data that I collected from all of the different letters to make that accessible for the public to be able to kind of have access to the original data that you can use in different ways. But yeah, that's just a little, that's not even all of them. That was just the ones that I had time to write down when I saw that question. So it was a huge amount of organizations, individuals, and letter writing campaigns, as well as individuals writing in to try to support the idea of a refugee camp in the US.
Great, thank you. We have another interesting question. This one is, how does this project, and I believe that means the Morgenthau Holocaust Project, provide or plan to document the key and highly unusual for a First Lady role that Eleanor Roosevelt played in efforts to open America's doors to refugees as a liaison between refugee organizations and FDR, Sumner Wells, State Department, especially in the period 1938 to 42. Goes on to say the role of leaders of the refugee organizations themselves, especially Clarence Pickett, who was executive director of the American Friends Service Committee. They played quite a role. So I think I could probably comment kind of directly on the project at large for the the perspective from the perspective of the FDR Library. We're really fortunate that the Morgenthau Holocaust Project funding does provide for digitization, in addition to the digital scholarship that we've been featuring this week. But we're really hoping that our next steps in digitization will include a whole series of the Eleanor Roosevelt papers, because I think that is a very important and key set of materials that has not yet been put online. And it's pretty central, as this commenter had stated, central to the story of the Roosevelt administration's response to the Holocaust. There's one series that probably several thousand pages specifically dedicated to refugee or correspondence. And in that series, Eleanor Roosevelt writes to and from people who are pleading for help, and also to other government administrators for whom she was trying to make advocacy happen. So quite an astounding record situation there. So, but if other panelists would like to speak on this question, please feel free. Abby or Sylvia, how can we bring more light to these kind of records?
So I can just say, from what's currently available online, there is a lot of material under our selected digitized documents related to the Holocaust, which you can find through the Franklin database. And I believe that link got put into the chat. That should be available for you. So you can use Franklin, and you could search for the selected digitized documents related to the Holocaust, and there's materials in there related to Eleanor. But also we have quite a bit of digitized materials already up there related to Eleanor. And in terms of the Fort Ontario refugee camp, Eleanor was involved in visiting the camp and advocating for the camp. So that's something that I touch on in some of the digital humanities projects that I've done in terms of that particular War Refugee Board project. So I'll let anybody else say something if they want to about that.
Oh, Sylvia, I think you're muted.
General digitizing our records, making them available to the public, and highlighting stories that the records tell. It's very, very important. And sometimes, people don't know what records we have and what stories the records tell. And TED will basically highlight it and put it out there, and people can, as Jeff mentioned, students and teachers can work on using those records, learn history, and learn how to prevent the Holocaust from happening again.
Thank you. I have 3 questions asking about specific organizations and whether anyone's research has come across references to these. So I'll just list them for you. National Council of Jewish Women, and Women's American ORT, and also did the National Conference for Christians and Jews come up in either terms of correspondence from this group? Any reference to any of those organizations?
I know for sure that the National Council for Jewish Women is definitely represented in the letters. The other organizations, I'll have to take a little bit of time and look those up. Let's see. Yeah, none of the other ones stood out to me, but that doesn't mean they're not there. It's I think we entered data for around 1,000 letters, and there's more than 3,000 letters total. that are represented in that part of the War Refugee Board Papers. So it's a huge amount of, of potential for research.
Thank you. Yes, I think potential is sort of the running theme here for listing all these resources, and the research possibilities is just almost overwhelming, the options that are available. I guess as a final thought or closing question, if anyone could comment a little bit more about how important it is to put primary sources back into the conversation and the forefront of educational resources and research. So, contemporary Holocaust scholarship, and why are primary sources so important right now?
Well, primary sources are important because there's so much question about the truth now, and people have different variations of the truth. And what's beautiful about the primary source is that you can go back to that document, that photograph, that film, that object, that was created by folks with firsthand knowledge, and you can gain so much firsthand knowledge from looking at that. Now, obviously, it has to be corroborated, with other sources. You never just take one source and run with that. But these primary sources offer us these pieces that we can put together, and this is so important, especially with students, because without looking at the primary sources, they're getting all their information from secondary sources, and many of those are not necessarily credible sources. So that's, I think, why it's so important to education.
Any other thoughts? Nicola, I know that being able to work with Vrba's papers must have been a meaningful experience for you, having so much background knowledge in his story.
To me, the primary sources are the most reliable, just as Jeffrey said. So definitely it has importance and meaning. The problem is that, let's say, when we saw the Verba collection, there is nothing from Auschwitz because nothing really survived. We couldn't take anything with him. So the first document, primary the report itself, but from the camp itself, we didn't bring anything.
Okay, I wish we had more time. I'm sorry, but we are at the end of the session. I want to thank everyone for joining us. Thank you very much to our presenters and to the audience. We actually have our keynote address happening this afternoon, so I hope everyone will attend. It's an address by Michael Berenbaum, and its title is What We Know Now and What We Knew Then, and it begins at 3 o'clock Eastern Time. So I do hope we'll see you again